Hello everyone, and let us continue our discussion on database management systems. So till now, we were discussing about data models. Like we discussed about what are the types, like we discussed many types, right? So in this particular module, we'll be discussing in detail about relational model. So what happens is, in case of relational model, we all know that we store data in form of a table, right? Tabular format is used. But in this module, let us understand in detail how the table is created, what are the things we need to include in the table, what are the features, what are the restrictions, what are the constraints. Let us talk about each of them in detail, and let us begin with what is a relational model. Now we have an idea that we store data in form of tables in relational model. So for this tables, what happens? Let us have an analogy with AR model. In AR model, we used to have some real world object as our entity, and then we used to have some attributes which used to describe our object, right? So in entity relationship model, we used to have this kind of structure where one entity and then other attributes are there. But in relational model, what we will do is we will have a table where all the columns will correspond to the properties to describe that particular entity. Like we'll be having attributes as our columns, and then each row will define a separate entity, like a unique entity. So let us understand with an example. Let us draw a ER model and then analyze it. How do we relate it with AR, a relational model? Let us take an example of student. Like, so if I'm drawing about student, let us have my entity as student. What are the things I can have for the student? I can have some name, I can have some roll number, primary key, and some marks, right? Let us keep it simple and let us talk about these three attributes only. Now, if I want to convert this into a relational model, let's say relational model, I want to convert it now. So, how do I do that? First step is just create a table. Let us create one. Now, in this table, as I mentioned before, all the properties which describe this entity will be our columns of this table. So, all the attributes, let us write them as columns. So, let us write roll number. This is our column 1. Then marks. Better to have name first. Name and marks. So, now that we have all our columns as our attributes, we are done with the table. Like what is the structure of table? We are done with it. Now consider a scenario where roll number 1 is Priya and has got 80 marks, and roll number 2 is Raj and has 50 marks. Now these two particular examples, right? These are two particular examples. They put these are two particular examples, and they correspond to two different entities, right? And with the help of this roll number, you're uniquely able to identify these entities. So what happens in relational model is each of the row, note that this each row determines, each row defines a particular entity. Like these three parameters, roll number, like 1 here, Priya, and 80, are used to describe that particular student, right? So our each row corresponds to each entity, can I say that? And our each column corresponds to attributes. I think we're clear. How do we have a structure of table? Like we're clear with it, right? So let us understand about the technical things. So in relational model, for each table, we call it as relation, right? Each table, the term we use is relation. Now, do not confuse it with the relation which we used to have in ER model. In ER model, the association between entities, we used to call it as relation. But here in relational model, we call the table as a relation. Now about row. About rows. What do we call a row? Like we call each row as tuple, right? So this is just the term that each row which we are having, which corresponds to each entity, we call it as tuple. Now the number of attributes, like here we had three number of attributes, right? So number of attributes, we call it as degree. Number of attributes, we call it as degree of our table. And the number of rows which we have, like number of entities which we are storing in that table, we call it as cardinality. So number of rows or entities, we call it as cardinality. Okay, so these are the technical terms. Let us keep them aside, and I think we're clear about how do we store, what is the structure. So why, let's understand why are we storing, why are we talking about relational model. So whenever a database is designed, a general practice is that we'll first have an AR model to have a clear view, like visual representation. Then we will relate it, like we will formulate it in a relational model. And after after drawing it in a relational model, what do is we implement it in computers. Okay, so this is the flow which generally happens. Now we have an idea about what is the relational model, what is an ER model, and now we need to learn about what is an relational model to have the next step of this flow. So I think to understand an example, let us talk, and now we converted one entity into a table. But how do we represent a relation in a table? Let us talk about it, and instead of talking, let's have an example and discuss it, right? So let's have our ER diagram, one basic ER diagram, that student is enrolled in course. Let us take that example. So we'll have our two entities, student, and we have our course, right? So what can we have? Like course can have some course number, some name of the course, instructor, and student can have name, then a roll number and marks. Now we have a relation between these, that a student enrolls in a course. Okay, so now how do I represent it in a form of table? Let us begin with whatever we discussed till now, and let us draw two tables for course and student. So let us draw here, like for our customer we'll be having for our course we'll be having course ID, then course name and instructor. And for our student, we had same details before, like roll number, student ID, we had roll number, name and marks. So now that we are clear, how do we represent each entity in a table? Now to consider this particular relation, what we do is we have a concept of foreign key. Now till now we discussed about primary key, right? Where it was unique and it was used to store some data, some unique attributes, and used to recognize each entity uniquely. So Now, to have a relationship, what we use is we build a foreign key. Like for each particular student, we add one more column of course ID. So what happens is, for like let's assume that course number 1 name is DBMS and instructor is me. Now course number 2 name, let's say DSA, and instructor is, let's say, some XYZ name. Now our two particular students, like before, name was Priya and Raj, had marks 80 and 50, like we discussed this example. So what I can do is, I want to know which course both of them are enrolled in. So instead of relating it, how do I mention what is the course? So I can use any of the attribute to describe this course here. But what is the attribute which uniquely helps us to identify the course? It is primary key, right? So we prefer to use primary key, and will use the primary key ID, right? Let's say if I want to say that Priya is enrolled in a DBMS course, so I'll have course ID 1 corresponding to Priya. But Raj is enrolled in DSA course, so I'll use course ID 2 to relate it with this. So this is how we relate things, right? Now we're clear how do we represent ER diagram in form of a relational model. Now let us come back and talk more about how do we implement this relational diagram. So there is something known as RDBMS. There is something known as RDBMS, which is relational data DBMS. So what happens here is, here the actual table, the table which we are talking about here, is implemented in computer. Like some examples are very widely used: MySQL, then we have Oracle, then we have Microsoft Access. So these are the examples for RDBMS. Like, just understand it as a software which helps you to relate all the tables and have a soft copy implemented in a computer. So I think we are done with the brief introduction about relational model. Let us talk about its features and properties in the next video.